The vicious murder of Bob Crane was one of Hollywood's most sinister mysteries for more than 40 years. However, the silence is now being broken by his own kid. And whatever people were afraid of concerning the situation is confirmed by what he discloses. This is more than just the sad demise of a well-liked performer. It is a labyrinth of betrayal, secrets, and a truth that is not readily apparent. Bob Crane wasn't just another actor attempting to break in Hollywood in the early 1960s. The next big thing was him. As the star of Hogan's Heroes, a World War II sitcom that defied all odds by using a prisoner of war camp as the setting for a comedy television show, he became well known due to his captivating smile and fast-witted humor. Crane portrayed Colonel Robert Hogan, the affable and astute American officer who consistently outsmarted the clumsy Nazis, for 6 seasons. Critics lauded him, audiences adored him, and to the general public, Bob Crane embodied the epitome of clean American television. However, Crane's success was not solely due to his on-screen prowess. A former disc jockey with a sharp sense of humor and a talent for calming people, he was a media darling. He had a distinct advantage because of his experience in radio, and he was skilled at using charm as a weapon. He was clean, likable, and relatable. That was the picture that the studios wanted the world to see, however. Another picture was developing behind the scenes. One that suggested a man who was not totally content with himself. There were murmurs even as Crane's star rose. His growing interest in technology, particularly audio and video equipment, was seen by colleagues. He began bringing recorders and cameras to the set. It appeared to be a harmless pastime at first. When it comes to technology, Crane was always a trailblazer, frequently experimenting with recording equipment for amusement. However, this fixation developed into something far more strange over time. He started recording everything, including private, intimate moments as well as backstage activities and rehearsals. Crane's marriage was starting to fall apart at home. Fame changed everything for him and his wife, Tertian, who had been high school sweethearts. The growing distance, the attention from female fans, and the long hours. The fissures soon become too big to ignore. In 1970, they got divorced. Crane promptly got married again, this time to Sigrid Valdis, his co-star from Hogan's Heroes. However, even that partnership would not endure. Crane was no longer network television's biggest star by the middle of the 1970s. He was having trouble finding work, and his career was deteriorating. Far from the limelight he formerly held, he played parts in dinner theater performances. The former star of one of the most popular television programs was now trying to maintain what little reputation he still had by performing in small venues around the nation. However, despite his career's decline, Crane's personal life was becoming even more bizarre. He had immersed himself in a world that few were aware of, one that was driven by compulsive behavior, voyeurism, and more dubious decisions. He met a man here who would shape the remainder of his life and, ultimately, his demise. On screen, Bob Crane was the golden boy, but off-screen, he was sinking into a world that few could have predicted. A man caught between the image he sold to America and the secrets he kept hidden behind his doors, between public admiration and private obsession. And what followed would permanently ruin his legacy in addition to destroying the illusion. Bob Crane's private life was becoming increasingly complicated and unsettling by the time his television celebrity had begun to wane. What had started out as a harmless interest in photography had turned into an obsession. Crane was doing more than simply recording his professional life. He was obsessively documenting his private life, particularly his interactions with women. He used cameras, lights, and tripods to record everything, frequently without completely revealing his goals. He was still the friendly TV personality to the outside world. But something far darker consumed him behind closed doors. It was during this time that Sony Electronics regional sales manager John Henry Carpenter came into play. Carpenter made great friends with Crane and provided him with video equipment. However, their bond went beyond simple friendship. It was an unsettling collaboration. They led a perverse lifestyle together that was focused on control, surveillance, and seduction. Carpenter would frequently travel with Crane, assisting in luring women back to hotel rooms where the two men would record private moments on video. Many of these women were unaware that they were being filmed. The toll of this double life started to mount. In addition to being a personal joy, Crane's addiction to these experiences and his ongoing documentation of them became an essential aspect of who he was. He carefully categorized his tapes, keeping them in boxes with names and dates written on them. The focus had shifted from intimacy and connection to control, proof, and the obsessive drive to repeat past events. He was documenting the moment rather than living it. His closest friends and family began to notice changes. He grew more and more alone, emotionally aloof, and suspicious. His friendships were eroding, and his second marriage was failing. Once captivating millions with his charm and humor, the man was now reclusive, unpredictable, and enmeshed in his vices. He grew increasingly cut off from the rest of his life the more he indulged in his private world. Despite the decline of his career and the disintegration of his personal life, Crane appeared incapable or unwilling to stop. He continued to shoot. Despite mounting strain and uneasiness, he continued to gather and kept Carpenter by his side. Carpenter was not the type of man who let go easily, but there were reports that Crane wanted to sever relationships in order to escape the hold this lifestyle had on him. Crane was leading a parallel life, one that was full of secrets he never imagined being revealed. But his entire world, his relationships, his notoriety, and even his meticulously concealed private life was about to fall apart. In the most heinous and conspicuous manner possible. Bob Crane was discovered dead after a bludgeoning in his Scottsdale, Arizona, residence early on June 29, 1978. It was a gruesome and uncannily accurate scene. His body was found in bed with severe head damage and a camera tripod cord around his neck. The ceiling and walls were splattered with blood, but there were no indications of forced entry. No valuables were taken, and there were no direct witnesses. It was an intimate, well-planned murder that stunned the country. The news of Crane's passing struck Hollywood like a lightning strike. Initially, it was just the startling killing of a former TV personality. However, the story took a turn for the worst as more details came to light. Inside the apartment, investigators soon discovered a tangle of electronics, photos, and videotapes. Uncomfortably detailed footage of Crane's private life was captured in dozens of reels. Colonel Hogan had vanished, to be replaced by a man at the heart of a sinister mystery. John Henry Carpenter became the immediate focus of the investigation. Only the previous evening had he spent time with Crane. After discussing their tense friendship over dinner, they went back to their separate rooms in the same apartment building. When the police interrogated Carpenter, they discovered that the two had been arguing. According to rumors, Crane had told Carpenter that their friendship and all of its associated things had to cease. Carpenter acknowledged spending that evening in Crane's apartment, but asserted that Crane never came back. But in Carpenter's rental car, police discovered bloodstains that matched Crane's blood type. The breakthrough should have come from this, but something went wrong. In 1978, DNA technology was non-existent. Without a murder weapon, the blood could not be positively matched. Every day the case got weaker. Even worse, some evidence appeared to disappear. Samples of blood were handled improperly. Crucial physical evidence was either never gathered or was tainted. Much of the evidence that may have directly linked Carpenter to the crime was lost forever due to the disorganized nature of the initial inquiry. There was a suspect in custody. They had a reason. Even if they had circumstantial evidence, it was insufficient to make an arrest. Bob Crane's image continued to deteriorate as the media frenzy grew more intense. His private existence seemed to be the main topic of every article about his murder rather than the case's resolution. The man who used to make America laugh was now a regular on the tabloids, remembered for the gloom surrounding his death rather than his skill. Since no one else was regarded as a credible suspect, Carpenter was able to go free for years, and the case gradually started to lose public attention. However, it never really went away for Crane's family or the one individual who never gave up on the idea that justice may be served. The murder investigation of Bob Crane was beset by errors from the start. They had a clear motive, a definite suspect, and even trace evidence that would link Carpenter to the crime, according to detectives. However, they lacked the scientific knowledge and the determination to see the case through to the end. And the little proof they did have started to elude them over time. Almost instantly, the crime scene had been tainted. In the hours after Crane's body was found, curious neighbors, inexperienced police officers, and even members of the media were permitted to stroll around the apartment. Important evidence, such as the murder weapon, was never located, and forensic procedures were irregular. Although the video equipment was boxed up, it was never carefully examined for fingerprints or other forensic information, even though it might have included more clues. The way the blood evidence was handled was even more incriminating. Just outside the apartment complex, investigators found tiny bloodstains in Carpenter's rented automobile. When the blood was analyzed at the time, it was determined to be Bob Crane's blood type. However, that was insufficient in the 1970s. Prosecutors were concerned that blood typing would not stand up in court since it was too general and lacked DNA. Although the samples were kept in storage, many of them were misplaced, deteriorated, or handled improperly over time, rendering them useless. Nevertheless, the demand for answers grew. Since Crane was well known, the media paid close attention to the scandalous circumstances surrounding his passing. However, Hollywood was unwilling to delve farther since it was already shaken by its image issues in the 1970s. Many people in the profession discreetly distanced themselves from Crane because of his embarrassing secret life. The lawsuit languished without institutional or public backing. There was renewed interest in the early 1990s, when Scottsdale detectives made the decision to use modern technologies to revive the investigation. Finally, DNA analysis was a practical instrument. They re-examined the original blood samples taken from Carpenter's vehicle. Even when a few traces could still be used, the results were not conclusive. The DNA was incomplete, deteriorated, and finally insufficient to provide a conclusive match. In 1992, Carpenter was accused of murder. However, that trial would conclude with doubt, just as the initial probe did. The prosecution made extensive use of circumstantial evidence throughout the trial. They depicted a man who was despised and in need, as well as a friendship that had degenerated into something toxic. However, the defense retorted with plausible justifications and highlighted the absence of tangible proof. Following a widely reported trial, Carpenter was found not guilty in 1994. Until his passing in 1998, he insisted in his innocence. The result was heartbreaking for Crane's family. The only individual ever taken seriously as a suspect had just left. And the case was essentially deemed dead because there were no fresh leads, no conclusive evidence, and a story that the public was getting sick of. Not everyone, though, was prepared to let it go. One individual has spent decades living under the shadow of that tragedy. Someone who was aware that his father's grave did not contain the truth. And he was at last prepared to speak after years of quiet. Bob Crane Jr. remained out of the public eye for decades. He quietly established a life away from Hollywood while the media was consumed with his father's shocking demise. A son who had experienced the turmoil, the rumors, and the unsolved questions, however, was hiding behind that quiet. In recent years, he made the decision to face the reality that the world had long disregarded. Bob Jr. made the decision to come forward through interviews and, most significantly, a memoir that reveals the truth about what actually transpired behind closed doors. His remarks go beyond those of a distraught son. These are the words of someone who lived inside the narrative, who saw his father's obsession with celebrity, secrecy, and a connection that was more darker than the general public ever realized. The extent of Bob Crane Jr.'s knowledge even at the time of the murder is among the most shocking discoveries. He talks about discovering dozens of cassettes, notes, and journals when he went through his father's house following the crime. Police had never examined some of these objects. Family members discreetly withdrew others, perhaps out of embarrassment or fear. According to Crane Jr., his father's way of life was not just careless but also harmful. Furthermore, he thinks his father discovered it too late. Speaking candidly, he accuses John Henry Carpenter of being domineering and manipulative. Crane Jr. said his father had made several attempts to get away from Carpenter, but Carpenter always managed to get back in. He claims that although their connection was founded on a shared devotion, it eventually became a one-sided preoccupation. According to him, Carpenter was more than simply a friend, he was someone who had to maintain control over Bob Crane's life despite the fact that it was unraveling. The fact that Crane Jr. claims that warning indicators were disregarded is maybe the most horrifying aspect of his story. Bob Sr. had been afraid in the weeks before the murder. He had admitted to close pals that he was being followed and watched. He had even begun recording strange phone conversations and arguments. Although no one took it seriously, Crane Jr. thinks his father knew something was coming. His autobiography is more than just a way for him to vent. It directly contradicts the official story. It charges that the legal system gives up too quickly. Of not defending a man attempting to flee a reality that had already engulfed him. Most importantly, it doesn't allow the narrative to conclude in quiet. Because this was never just a murder to Bob Crane Jr. It was about revealing the truth and what so many had attempted to ignore. Something had changed in the last weeks of Bob Crane's life. His friends observed that he seemed tight, preoccupied, and frequently glanced over his shoulder. He had started complaining about the individuals in his immediate vicinity. John Henry Carpenter in particular. Bob Crane Jr. claimed that his father was becoming more and more desperate to break away from the way of life they had created together. It felt suffocating now, not exciting. Crane began to postpone Carpenter's appearances. He was attempting to re-establish boundaries by withdrawing from their shared activities. He mentioned making a clean separation with everyone, not just Carpenter, in talks with close pals, but from the whole web of ignorance that had engulfed his existence. He desired to return to his roles as a working actor, a parent, and a man free from shadows. Carpenter, however, was unwilling to be disconnected so quickly. Crane was clearly unsettled by the arguments, heated discussions, and phone calls. Crane Jr. claims that 2 nights before to the murder, one of these calls occurred. He recalls a statement made by his father that troubled him for years. "Try looking at John if I ever get in trouble." Looking back, it sounds more like a warning, a last-ditch effort to be heard before it was too late, even though at the time it sounded like psychosis. Isolation marked Crane's final days. He appeared more aloof than ever, despite being on tour for a play. He was described by co-workers as being extremely serious and quickly upset. He had even started to discuss retiring completely, stopping the touring, abandoning the stage, and beginning anew. However, none of those plans would ever materialize. He and Carpenter reportedly made one last effort to patch things up by having dinner together the night before he was murdered. The meeting was a failure. Crane made it obvious, according to sources. That was the end. No more Carpenter, no more tapes, no more excursions. After that, they split up. Crane's body was discovered in his bed the following morning. No broken locks or indications of forced entry. The person who killed him had either never left or had been welcomed in. The pieces were too clear for Crane Jr. to overlook. A friendship that is fading. The timing of it all, a father attempting to flee, and a suspect who has every reason to keep him quiet. No one had paid attention, despite the fact that it was not just tragic but also planned. However, Bob Crane's son would not remain silent indefinitely. He was aware that justice was still to be served by the truth itself if it could not be obtained through the legal system. Bob Crane's story is still relevant almost 40 years after his passing, not just because it is mysterious but also because it sheds light on celebrity, secrecy, and how easily justice may be overlooked. This was more than a simple murder. It was a warning story that questions how we view famous people and the safeguards put in place to keep them safe. Bob Crane's public persona was meticulously constructed. On the small screen, he was the endearing television hero, a representation of humor and morality. Beneath the limelight, however, was a guy in great distress, struggling with uncontrollable compulsions. The failure of those around him and the organizations entrusted with looking into his death is what sealed the tragedy's fate, even though his decisions may have added to the pandemonium that engulfed him. In many respects, when Bob Crane passed away, the world was not prepared to accept the whole reality of his existence. The notion that a popular sitcom star could have such a contentious lifestyle was too unsettling to face in the 1970s. The legal system decided to step carefully, but the media decided to sensationalize the story. Silence held in place of clarity. There were rumors rather than answers. However, Crane's narrative has started to come to light again thanks to advancements in forensic science, new digital investigation tools, and a rising willingness to re-examine cold cases. Public interest has been rekindled by investigative podcasts, true crime documentaries, and interviews with Crane Jr. Because the previously unavailable technologies may now be available, people are looking for answers. One of the most vocal advocates for a re-examination of the case has been Crane Jr. He has called on authorities to use modern technologies to reopen the inquiry. Digital image analysis, advanced DNA testing, and even psychological profiling may provide fresh insight into previously rejected material. Some important components might be lost forever, but others might still contain secrets that need to be discovered. Beyond the technical aspect, a more profound and human element is involved. The cost of remaining silent, the peril of ignoring warnings, and the way that notoriety may protect both the criminal and the innocent are all issues that Crane's novel compels us to consider. Since time in this instance merely raised new questions, it calls into question the notion that time always offers closure. Even though Bob Crane is no longer with us, his son's voice is becoming more and more loud every year. He won't allow the scandal to be the only thing that people remember about his father. In addition to seeking justice, he wants history to demonstrate that there are actual people, broken families, and important truths behind every headline.